Underwood Xtreme Defender 9mm+P versus 327 Federal Magnum. So our 9mm+P is a 90 grain Xtreme Defender fluted bullet rated at 1475 feet per second. Our 327 Federal Magnum is a 95 grain fluted bullet rated at 1500 feet per second. So I'm going to use my 5-inch M&P 2.09 to test the 9mm+P, and my Ruger SP101 with a 4.2-inch barrel to test the 327 Federal Magnum. You know, why do I use a 4-inch barreled revolver versus a 5-inch auto? Because they're about the same overall size and barrel travel in there. Because you don't count the chamber when you're talking the barrel length with this, or you do count the chamber. So 5 inches includes the chamber. With this, the chamber is not included. So they're about the same size, about the same amount of barrel travel. If I were to compare a 4-inch semi-auto like this TX22 here, you'd actually have an inch less travel in that gun, and that would not be a comparable size. But the 5-inch semi-auto is a comparable size. So we're gonna see what we get with these. So I'm gonna go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy I get at the same time. Then I'm gonna do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So I'm gonna go into plain 10% clear ballistics to see what the best potential of these are. You know, if they were hollow points, sometimes fabric can clog the hollow points. That's not gonna be a problem here. But also I do use rib simulation, so that could slow down its potential for penetration. So just before I do any of that, I'm going to do a plain clear ballistics shot to see what the best potential is. And then after that, I'm going to do a real world simulation where I'm going to have 4 layers of denim on this first 3-inch piece that represents a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4-inch medium density fiber board to represent hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4-inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. Clear ballistics is roughly a half representation of the density of flesh. So 3 inches in gel is more like 1.5 inches in real flesh. You know, 16 inches here is more like 8 inches. So we're really trying to represent an 8.5 inch, 9-inch individual with ribs on the front and back. So if I can keep those bullets within this back rib simulation right here, I consider that a success. But if they go beyond that, you know, it's a little questionable if they're going to over penetrate through an average size target. So we'll do a plain clear ballistic shot, then a real world simulation shot, and then I will shoot at the steel target and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. So well, let's get started with this test. All right, first up we have our 9mm+P 90 grain rated at 1475 feet per second. Let's see how close I get to that in my 5-inch M&P here. See how close I get to 1475 feet per second. 1464, 1489, 1463, 1464, 1448, so a little bit below that rated velocity. Interesting there. Now our 327 Federal Magnum, it's a 95 grain. We're rated at 1500 feet per second. So let's see how close I get to that in my 4.2-inch Ruger SP101. 1419. 1408, 1435, 1392, 1398. So I had some better high hopes for this stuff. So to be that low, you know, this is less powerful than the 9mm at this point, I believe. So yeah, they're very close in energy, but yeah, they're both below the rate of velocity. And no, it's not from the temperature out here. A lot of people get the idea that, you know, because it's winter time, automatically everything's slower. I've done tests on that, and basically there's no difference unless you freeze the ammo and you leave it out in the snow. Then you'll get about 20 feet per second less than what you would in warm weather. Where people are getting this idea is that in wintertime the air is more dense, so if you shoot a rifle bullet at hundreds of yards down range, that'll be moving slower than what it would be in summer when the air is less dense. At, you know, 6 yards, there is going to be no change because of the weather, because of the temp. So what you're seeing with very low velocity is how they're loaded. So let's hit our ballistics gel block and see how these compare. All right, first up, our plain clear ballistic shot, no fabric in the way that could potentially clog a hollow point if they were a hollow point. A little redundant here, but I like to stay consistent when I do move on to my real world simulation. So no fabric in the way that could potentially clog a hollow point, no rib simulation that could potentially slow down its penetration. So let's see what we get here with our 9mm+P Xtreme Defender. All right. Set that with our 327 Federal Magnum. Let's take a look. All right, pretty similar performance, except for, you know, the 9mm got a little more damage, it looks like, but it's kind of deceptive because the damage is actually the same. What you're seeing here, what it looks like damage anyway. It's just that the 327, that wide track you see on the 9mm+P is actually, it's horizontal, so you're not seeing it, but it's roughly the same width if you were to turn this block on its side. I'm not going to turn it on its side, but yeah. And when we look at our energy dump in this first 3-inch piece here, you know, interesting because it almost looks like the 327 on top did more damage. But, you know, damage is kind of deceptive with this type of thing here. You know, what these flutes are supposed to do is they're supposed to take the pressure and turn it inward and create cutting damage. Now, I do see things that look like striation cutting, so I'll give it that. It does look like it's doing that. It's not just tumbling, even though they are tumbling. They are creating striations, which are very similar to the cutting patterns I see with jacketed hollow points. And they look pretty good, but it's hard for me to say they're better than jacketed hollow points. Oh, we'll get to that later. It's not that I don't like these. A lot of people think I don't like these. It's not that. It's just that there's not a lot of street cred on them. So you have to kind of be skeptical of ammo companies' claims when they say stuff. But anyways, what we got with our 9mm+P, so we got about 18¼ inches. So that's pretty good penetration. That's not really over penetrating. Now our 327 Federal the bullet is backwards, and our total path is right there at 19½ inches. So with their lower weight than typical, or at least lower sectional density because they're copper, you know, they don't tend to over penetrate, because they dump their energy pretty quickly. So even though they're not expanding, they're losing their momentum pretty quickly, so they're not over penetrating, which is a good thing. But let's put on our fabric, put in our rib simulation, and see how these compare in our real world simulation. All right, our real world simulation, 4 layers of sweatshirt material, followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics that represents hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. You know, if I can stay within that first block without going through the back rib simulation, I consider that an immediate success. If it goes through that back rib simulation, we have to kind of analyze it and see if, you know, I think it would over penetrate and be unsafe to use. So let's hit it with our 9mm+P. All right. Now, real world simulation, 327 Federal Magnum. Let's go take a look. Yeah, so this is some interesting results, and I can tell you right now, before I even pull this rib simulation out, and I have not pulled it out, and I could be wrong here, but it looks like the 9mm went straight through that rib simulation, and it looks like to me from that damage, the 327 is probably tumbling through that rib simulation. That's why the track is so wide. Let's take a look here. Yep, so I'm honest here, I did not pull this out and look. It's just, I've been doing this for years, and that's what I see. And that's some of the secret to why some of this works pretty good. because the flutes do sometimes initiate some immediate tumbling. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we can see with the 327, it didn't underpenetrate or overpenetrate, and it basically more reliably did what a TUI would do. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I'm not here to hate on this. It's very consistent, and that's one thing I've seen with these rounds over the years, is they are very consistent. So our 9mm+P did pretty good. It looks somewhat similar to a hollow point damage, depending on the hollow point. You know, a lot of hollow points do about this. Now, if you're talking like a HST or something like that, that does do a little bit more striation cutting than this. But this doesn't look too bad. And with our 9mm+P, we got, and give it exactly 18 inches, which isn't bad. It's pretty good. Now our 327 Federal, we're at 17¼ inches, so it significantly lowered that penetration simply from, you know, tumbling. So interesting, not bad overall. Yeah, it's not bad, and the reason why they're not bad is because they are creating a good amount of damage, whether it be from tumbling or whether it be from inward pressure, and they're not significantly over penetrating. So we're keeping that energy in the target, and that really is, when you talk about ballistics, internal ballistics, I mean terminal ballistics, I should say, you know, the most important thing is you keep that bullet in your target. There are some exceptions, and the main reason why it's important is because if it simply passes through, well, you're not using that energy effectively. It would be better that it stays in the target and tumbles at least, because that'll do a lot more damage. Now there's some exceptions, like a 44 Magnum. If it's going to fully expand or rip a 3/4 inch hole all the way through it and then pass through, well, that doesn't really matter at that point. But when you're talking normal rounds, yeah, it's good they stayed in here and they did good. So let's pull these out of the block. I'll take a close-up look at them. Then I'm going to shoot our steel and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through plain gel, our 9mm+P and our 327 Federal here. And before I show these bullets a little closer, I do want to make a mention. Every time there's snow on the ground, people say your results are invalid because it's cold out. And get to the heart of what they're saying. They think that I store these out in the woods or something. These are stored inside, and the internal temp of these synthetic gel blocks is about 68 degrees. And I oftentimes warm my fingers on the inside of them when I'm cutting them open. And everything except the outer 1/4 inch or so is like interior house temp. I'm warming my fingers. So they're not cold and skewing the results. I keep them in my house, you know, 365 days a year before I bring them out, so that the temperature in the inside of these blocks is the same all year round. So I just want to make a mention of that before I move on here. And I didn't show a picture of these close up like I normally do, because there's no reason to. The reason why I would do that is to show expansion, but these have no deformation at all. So here's our 327 and here's our 9mm. Our 9mm has a concave base. 327 has a flat base. And you can see the sectional density is quite a bit higher with that 327. It's very long, and that will induce the tumbling. That's really what induces it. As when you have a short bullet, it's not going to do that. And once through our rib simulation, there's essentially no change. Now, I have shot these through auto glass before in the past, and the flute's completely removed. So by the time they actually hit the gel going through glass, there's no flutes. But when it's just going through my rib simulation, they stay very solid. This copper is obviously harder than wood. So, yeah, this thing doesn't want to focus today. But yeah, really no change to those. But interesting to see close up anyway. So lots of close up look at those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target. So I'm just going to get a front sight picture, pop these rounds off as fast as I think I can hit the target, and just kind of see how they feel for controllability. Because they are light rounds. So you get a little bit less muzzle rise, especially with the 9mm. 327 is actually a pretty typical bullet weight for that caliber, but this is kind of light. Let's see how these things will shoot. All right, so problem with these, it's kind of hard to see where you even hit because they don't flatten like a hollow point. 327 Federal. Let's see how these things do. Now, I will say for 327, that is actually a pretty low recoiling round. I mean, they're not super powerful, but they are very low recoiling for a 327 Federal. So very comfortable to shoot. So let me back it up to 75 yards just for fun and just see how these things hit, see where their point of impact is, if there's a big shift or not versus typical rounds. All right, 75 yards from the target for fun. Let's see how these things will shoot. I'm just gonna get a front sight picture, aim center mass, try to fire as slow as I can. And see how these things will shoot for me. So 9mm+P. See what this does. So I think I missed a few. I'm not really sure what's going on, but it does look like probably they were impacting low because typically really fast rounds, they do impact lower rather than higher for me. I've noticed at that distance. I don't know the exact science behind that, but 327, see what this does. That one might have actually hit high. I think I've seen that phenomenon before where 327 will hit higher or something like that. Let me fire one single action, see where I think they're going. I'm not sure. Alright, so I think the misses were just me because the hits I made, I did aim center mass. I haven't fired this revolver in probably 2 months. You know, that sounds like an excuse, but sometimes that's the reason why. But anyways, both these seem pretty good overall. Now, these would not be my first option here. And here we are onto this thing where people take this as, I hate Xtreme defenders. I don't hate them, and they look promising. The problem I have is that the claims seem to be piling up while there's not even basic amounts of confirmed, data on those. Which police departments use them? How did they perform when they were used to stop a threat? What incidences were they used to show that they're as effective as jacketed hollow points? I've tried to look that up. I find this much data on it. So, it would be irresponsible of me to be like, these have inward pressure. They can make as much damage as a hollow point. They will stop your threat as good as a jacketed hollow point because Underwood says so, or Lehigh says so. I can't, in good conscience, do that. I have to look at what I'm seeing and judge it by that. Now, there is something, and this is controversial as well, called hydrostatic shock. And there's other names for that. There's other names of like hydraulic pressure, this and that. And the basic idea is, if a round of ammunition moves at like over 2,200 feet per second, that temporary stretch cavity will actually become kind of permanent in a way. Because anytime a handgun bullet or a rifle bullet hits something, it's going to stretch, it's going to cause a little cavity, but a lot of times that'll just seal back up and it won't be a ton of damage to the surrounding tissue. And it gets bigger and bigger, and the claim is at 2,200 feet per second, it's so big that the stretching can't stretch anymore, and it's ripping from there. So even if this were a real thing, hydrostatic shock, these rounds are nowhere near that velocity to do that. So if they're nowhere near that velocity to do that, I have to take it as that, what we're seeing is temporary damage. And, what you see in gel is not the exact same thing you see in real tissue. You know, gel is very good for judging how big a hollow point expands, and it's very good for telling how deep the penetration goes, but it's very unreliable to look at it and be like, this looks like it did more damage than that. I mean, I do that at times because, hey, it's there, but it doesn't translate over the flesh exactly the same. So you can't be like, well, that did as much in gel as a hollow point, therefore it's as good. I have to take things by measurements and face value, and when I'm looking at a 9mm that's an Xtreme Defender that's 0.355 diameter when I recover it versus an HST that's like 0.68, I kind of have to say the hollow point for sure could have done a lot of cutting damage and cut a lot of tissue and cut a lot of vital things. I can't necessarily look at the Xtreme Defender in good conscience and say that's for sure going to do that. I have to look at the diameters and all of that. So all I can say is at this point, I can't say that they're as good as Jacket of Hollow Points. What I can say is that they are very consistent, and they tend to penetrate very deeply without over penetrating, and a lot of times they will tumble, and these are all not bad things. So you can take it for what you will. I would say overall these rounds are okay. The 327 you could do a lot better than this, because for a 327 that was pretty light, and you know I've tested a lot of rounds in the 500 foot-pounds range with massive expansion. I would rather carry that, but the recoil is pretty low. With 9mm, you know, the thing with this is the recoil is a lot lower than typical 9mm because the bullet weights are light. So I could kind of be like, well, I guess a 9mm it's fine. But anyways, that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.